Welcome back, everyone, as we dive right into part 2 of the Vietnam War from Things I Care About. If you did not see part 1 of this reaction, then the link is in the description. It'll take you back to that, as well as the link to the original content for part 2. Definitely want to encourage everyone to check out the original content. Thank you to everybody who commented on yesterday's video. Some great feedback. I was in particular really excited to hear from several of you who are either Vietnamese or Vietnamese Americans, and your perspective in particular was really great to hear from, to give that added layer of information and perspective to all of this. So with that in mind, we're going to dive right into part 2. I want to thank Justin. Justin, I don't have a location for you. You didn't provide an address, but signed up as a patron about a week ago, and I appreciate your support. Could not do this without people like you. Let's go ahead and dive into part 2.
The North realized that fighting the Americans head-on would not work, so they decided to switch strategy. It is time for guerrilla warfare.
And this is typically what any power will do against a much stronger opponent. The United States employed that very strategy when fighting against the British. You have to adapt your tactics to give yourself a chance when your opponent has a major advantage, especially in things like air power.
By 1966, Rolling Thunder was proving to be a massive failure. With help from their good pals China and the Soviet Union, the North Vietnamese Air Force was growing rapidly, and with their new and powerful network of anti-air defenses and radar systems, the North shot down hundreds of US planes. During this time, movement of troops from north to south tripled. So again, the US decided to change focus. Rolling Thunder now targeted the North's petroleum and oil capacity. They succeeded in destroying over 70% of it, and the communists hid the remaining fuel in populated areas they knew the US would not bomb.
So again, that's another strategy that you see very common, is that when your opponent has that strong ability to hit you from the air, you start getting much more strategic about where you place potential targets. You put it around things like hospitals and schools, hoping that if your opponent does hit it, it's going to be a PR nightmare for them. And unfortunately, that's what happens. Also, should mention when we're talking about all of these airmen being shot down, that one of the people shot down during this war, of course, is a Navy pilot by the name of John McCain. He's actually John McCain III. His father and grandfather were both admirals, and his father is actually the admiral that's running the Navy during the Vietnam War. So this is a big, big PR coup for the North Vietnamese to be able to have in their custody for multiple years the son of the head of the Navy in that area.
But despite the evident success of the operation, this phase of Rolling Thunder only made the North Vietnamese more determined to keep fighting and strengthened the Hanoi government. On paper, the anti-communist forces vastly outnumbered the communists, almost 400,000 Americans, nearly 750,000 ARVN troops, and some 50,000 from other allied nations.
And when he says ARVN, he means the Army of the Republic of Vietnam.
Fighting against an estimated 300,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army members who were hiding in the south. But despite their numbers, the Allies were trying to find and destroy a largely invisible enemy.
Right.
And while the Americans controlled key cities and strongholds, vast areas of South Vietnam were effectively hostile territory. Watch out! There's a Viet Cong fighter hiding here. Can you spot him? Of course you can't, because he was hiding in a spider hole, the most extensively used defensive structure. Spider hole.
And we saw stuff like this in World War II. The Japanese make extensive use of underground tunnels and fortifications that largely protected them from things like naval bombardments.
Were dug directly down into the earth and covered with vegetation for camouflage, making them almost impossible to spot in the jungle. When approached by the enemy, the hiding soldier waited as long as possible before revealing himself. This created surprise and confusion and meant that artillery, grenade launchers and air support would be at risk of friendly fire. If this was not hard enough to deal with, any Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army position would have carefully planned routes of withdrawal. So, if attacked, some troops engaged the Allied forces while the bulk of the unit retreated to safety. The Viet Cong would attack mostly in ambushes. They dug foxholes, trenches and other defensive positions across a roadway and carefully concealed them. They attacked just before dark, dealt as much damage as possible, and withdrew under the cover of night before the enemy had time to recover.
Now, I want to say something here, and I hope that everyone understands me the way this is intended. This is not intended to be a defense of one strategy or the other. It's to help with the mindset. One of the things that obviously comes out of this war is the idea of American soldiers in particular being labeled as baby killers. And we have stories like the My Lai massacre, which is horrifying. There's no way around that, where you have American soldiers just slaughtering people in a village. Not okay, never okay to murder civilians. That said, to understand the mindset a little bit, how long do you, as a soldier who is trying to fight a conventional war, deal with this kind of stuff before you stop caring who you're shooting at? Or before your psyche just gets to the place where you start seeing enemies everywhere? Because you are so used to guys just popping out of nowhere, ambush attacks, people that look like civilians that turn out to be enemy combatants. Pretty soon, the way you fight a war starts to change just because of the stress you're undergoing, because of the nature of the opponent that you're facing. Again, not to condone it, but to understand it. This was an ugly war on both sides. This is not a traditional war in any sense of the imagination.
A perfect example of the resourcefulness of the Viet Cong was a simple trap called the punji stick. It was just a sharpened wooden stick hidden in a hole in the ground. Sometimes it was large enough for a soldier to fall and impale himself. But even a single stake in a small hidden hole could be enough to pierce a soldier's foot and delay his entire unit.
And that's the key there, is it's actually better in that situation to wound a soldier than kill him. If he's killed, you can move on. You can get his body out of there. But he's wounded, several of his buddies are going to stop to help him, and you're delaying the entire force.
But the deadliest and most horrifying traps were the infamous Viet Cong booby traps. Bamboo whips, toe popper mines, hollowed out trees filled with explosives, snare traps, all kinds of tripwires. Many young Americans lost limbs and even their lives to these horrifying traps. About 20% of American casualties in the entire war were inflicted by either mines or booby traps.
And probably another 20 to 30% are friendly fire, which is typical in war. I mean, every war has a significant percentage of friendly fire. Vietnam, I think, was worse than most.
Thousands of unlucky civilians would also share this horrible fate. To counter these tactics, the US relied heavily on its artillery and carpet-bombed enemy positions before engaging them in battle. They also used napalm, a viscous gel that sticks to targets and burns slower and hotter than gasoline. Napalm was devastatingly effective against entrenched enemies. But while effective at killing the Viet Cong, these weapons were also excellent at accidentally killing civilians. Another major offender was the American artillery practice of harassment and interdiction. This meant firing explosive rounds at random intervals, often blindly and during the night, onto suspected enemy routes of movements like roads and rivers. Most of the time, nothing was hit. On rare occasions, an unlucky Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army unit would get shelled. But what would happen most often was this. What a lovely day. It's surely been rough these past couple of decades with all these wars and all, but at least I got my health and a beautiful wife at home. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army often sheltered near villages, hoping to avoid American fire, knowing that if they did attack them, the civilian casualties would turn more people against the Americans.
And see, that's the key to all of this for them, right? It's a win-win. I hate to say it that way, but that's what it is. If they don't attack because they're afraid of hitting civilians, you win because you stay alive. If they do attack, and in their attempt to hit you, they kill civilians, then that's a PR nightmare for the opponent. So either way, it works out for you.
Stupid vegetation. If there wasn't so much jungle, we could easily win this war. Well, they cannot hide in the jungle if there is no jungle. What? Let's just get rid of the entire jungle. That is genius.
And this is no different than in warfare. You always try to take out your enemy's opportunities for cover. You know, there's a scene, if you've ever seen the movie The Alamo, the recent one with Billy Bob Thornton, who I thought was amazing, by the way, as Davy Crockett, but I digress. There's a couple of buildings outside of the Alamo complex, and they're like, you know, that gives some great cover for the enemy, and so they take a little sortie out to go burn the buildings so that the enemy doesn't have cover there.
The Americans developed chemical herbicides to counteract the communist use of vegetation as cover. The US Air Force destroyed around 20% of the jungles of South Vietnam and between 20 and 50% of the mangrove forests in one of the largest single incidents of ecocide. The Viet Cong used an extensive network of underground tunnels to avoid detection. The largest one was the Cu Chi Tunnel Complex, which at its peak had over 200 miles of tunnels.
Wow.
In Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967, the Allies sent 30,000 troops to find and destroy the tunnels in an area called the Iron Triangle. US and Army forces bulldozed all vegetation from the region and used chemicals to contaminate the rice paddies. The civilian population of nearly 6,000 was forcibly relocated to other areas, and their homes and villages were burned down. The Viet Cong...
And this all sounds awful, but you're fighting a war. And war is ugly and awful, and civilians are always the ones who end up paying the most, unfortunately.
Did not defend the tunnels and simply evaded the attack. This operation was a clear example of the inherent flaws in the American strategy. From a tactical standpoint, the operation was a success. They obliterated the tunnels and forced the Viet Cong out. Yet the Viet Cong was operating in the region again within just 10 days, so in the end, nothing was accomplished. Oh, except that they all hate the US now. The war at this point was incredibly costly for both sides. Almost 20,000 Americans had already died, and the American public saw little point in the war. Protests broke out across the US, defying the draft and the continuation of the war. President Johnson reassured the public that the war was almost over.
And one of the things that's going to come out of all of this is there's going to be a constitutional amendment that changes the voting age in the United States, which at this point is 21. It's going to be changed to 18 out of that argument that, hey, if these people are old enough to go fight for their country, to be drafted and sent to a war that they didn't sign up for, they should be old enough to be able to vote too.
By the end of 1967, Le Duan believed that the South Vietnamese were eager to expel the Americans and their puppet government. So he and his allies conceived of a major offensive across the South, believing that the people there would rise up and topple the Saigon government. The North Vietnam Army gathered along the demilitarized zone, drawing American troops away from populated areas, while guerrillas moved clandestinely into every province and district capital, even into Saigon. There, they would wait for the signal to strike. The US fought fiercely to prevent the movement of enemy troops. One of the bloodiest battles occurred on Hill 875, which Americans attempted to secure. With 360 killed and almost 2,000 wounded, the battle was incredibly costly for Americans. It also saw the worst case of friendly fire in the Vietnam War, when an American plane mistakenly dropped a bomb right into the American-controlled perimeter, killing at least 42 Americans. The battle was technically a US victory, but Hill 875 had little strategic significance beyond having taken it from the North Vietnamese. So the Americans didn't gain anything, and the hill was back under enemy control within a week. Although the US had noticed the troop movements and tried to stop them, the scale of the offensive was a tremendous surprise. This was an intelligence failure comparable to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
I think maybe a better comparison would be the Ardennes offensive by the Germans in December of 1944, where you have a major Allied presence in the area and air supremacy and everything, but somehow they missed this massive buildup of Germans for this last offensive.
The offensive began on January 30, just before the festivity of Tet.
Yep, Tet
Around
offensive.
84,000 soldiers attacked over 100 targets across the south. They struck American bases all over the country, including the US Army headquarters at Long Binh Post and the South Vietnam headquarters at Tan Son Nhut. North Vietnam soldiers surged across the 17th parallel, but failed to take the American base at Khe Sanh. For the first time, the Americans and South Vietnamese could see who they were fighting against. Despite the ambush, they were now fighting on their terms. The northern armies attacked the former imperial capital of Hue, knowing that people there disliked the government and hoped for a major uprising. But it didn't happen. Still, the city's defenders were overwhelmed and the city fell quickly. The Viet Cong, attempting to consolidate power, went after American sympathizers and anyone they saw as opposition.
And this is the point at which, if you're the Americans, you start to finally acknowledge, okay, you know what? There doesn't seem to be a winning scenario here. What does winning look like, and is it really worth the continued cost? And you're going to start getting away from that sunk cost, the idea of just pouring more and more into it because you've already poured so much into it. And now it starts to be a conversation about how do we extricate ourselves from this situation in as positive a way as possible. And it's going to take years to do that.
Historians believe that between 2,000 and 8,000 people were killed. The Allies immediately began an assault to retake the city. By March, they kicked the communists out, and the fighting left the city in ruin. About half the buildings were destroyed, and 3/4 of its population was left homeless. The attack on Saigon went even worse, and the North failed to take any of their military targets. By any measure, the Tet Offensive was a staggering defeat for the North. It did not incite the widespread support it was supposed to, and brutal civilian massacres such as Hue worsened their reputation, turning many into anti-communists.
That all said, this is 1968. We are now into, you got to think about what's happening at home in the United States, okay? 1968 is the year that Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be assassinated in April. In, I think it's June of that year, Robert Kennedy is going to be assassinated. It's a presidential election year. The sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, announces he's not going to run for re-election. And so there's all kinds of political upheaval in the United States, not to mention all of the pushback and the protests. And, so whatever the military situation on the ground, however bad this is for the North, in the end, it's still not good for the U.S.
The Viet Cong suffered terrible losses and would never fully recover. But the Tet Offensive did accomplish one thing. It showed the world that the North was capable of launching large-scale surprise attacks. And right after President Johnson had promised that the war was almost over, the American public had seen live on TV the largest assault of the war.
He makes a great point here about TV. This is a key component of this. This is the first, at least for the United States, it's the first war the U.S. is involved in where you almost get real-time reports of what's happening. It's the closest you're going to get to that. Up until this point, World War II, Korea, the stuff that people are seeing, they're seeing in movie theaters, and it's usually stuff that's been presented to them by the government on these newsreels. You're not getting these independent reports live from locations like this. And so that has a big impact as well on the psychology of the Americans.
Trust in the government was further shattered, and the American public now demanded de-escalation and for the war to be turned over to South Vietnam.
That's an important point, too. This wasn't a U.S. is getting out and abandoning the war. It's the U.S. is saying, South Vietnam needs to defend for itself.
March 16th, American forces entered the village of My Lai. Believing it to be friendly to the Viet Cong, they rounded up the villagers around a ditch and executed them without mercy. They killed the elderly and children. Women and girls were abused before being shot in the head. American forces murdered 500 villagers and did their best to cover it up. It wasn't until 1969 that an investigation by journalist Seymour Hersh uncovered the truth. Only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted of 22 counts of murder, but after appealing, he only served 3 years of house arrest. Arthur Sylvester, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, was the man most responsible for giving, controlling, and managing the war news from Vietnam. You have a patriotic duty to disseminate only information that makes the US look good. Surely, Arthur, you don't expect the American press to be handmaidens of the government.
And this is an interesting shift, too, because by and large, in previous wars, the press has, I wouldn't say been complicit. I mean, though you have examples of that. 1898 is a great example. The USS Maine explosion, that's very much pushed by the press to kind of build people up toward a frenzy for war against Spain. But like in World War II, the press cooperated with the military and the government. I wouldn't say that they were basically like propaganda tools, though they certainly could be, but they would withhold information that might be damaging, not in terms of like knowledge, but in terms of like information about upcoming operations that could endanger soldiers if the word got out too soon. This is a different animal.
That is exactly what I expect. Look, if you think any American official is going to tell you the truth, you are stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid.
Actual quotes. Congressional Record of the House, May 1966.
The failure of the Tet Offensive. South Vietnam had become much stronger. They even managed to democratically elect a leader for the first time and wrote a constitution. In 1968, just before the US presidential elections, all sides were finally going to meet for the first time for peace talks. But South Vietnam withdrew unexpectedly. The Nixon campaign had contacted South Vietnam in secret and promised that they would be able to offer the Saigon government a better deal than the opposing candidate Hubert Humphrey if the South stayed away from the peace talks. President Johnson found out about this thanks to the CIA's illegal wiretapping of the US Embassy. Richard Nixon contacted a foreign government to sabotage peace talks, thus extending the war and leading to the deaths of thousands of additional Americans.
So while Richard Nixon gets the credit for eventually being the one who withdraws the U.S. from Vietnam, you have this.
All this for his own political gain, in an act that might even be considered treason. President Johnson
make that argument.
Didn't want to reveal how he had gotten this information, so he decided to say nothing. The peace talks failed, and the war continued. Nixon, now president, understood that the Americans were tired of their involvement in the war. Despite their losses, North Vietnam was still as committed to the war as ever, and while the South was stronger than before, it was not strong enough to survive without the United States.
Yeah.
So Nixon had a dilemma. He needed to get out of Vietnam, but not lose it. The solution? Vietnamization. Build up South Vietnam so that they could stand their ground against the North. The first step would be to go after the Viet Cong support in the countryside. The problem with invading a country and fighting a native population is that you cannot distinguish friend from foe.
Right.
Every single person is a potential informer, bomb thrower, or assassin.
And again, what does this do to the psyche of the people on the ground when anybody could be the enemy or they're not? How do you distinguish that, and how soon do you just say, screw it, kill them all?
The Allies decided to consider everyone until proven innocent to be part of the Viet Cong infrastructure of support. They implemented the Phoenix program, a coordinated effort to wipe out this infrastructure. South Vietnamese citizens were rounded up and jailed by the thousands without trial. Many were killed on the spot or tortured for information. According to CIA members, no one ever survived the torture. Official death tolls are hard to estimate. The CIA claims the dead to be around 20,000, while South Vietnam claimed that it was closer to 40,000. It is impossible to know the exact number or how many of these people were actual members of the Viet Cong. In 1971, the director of Phoenix, William Colby, was asked by a congressman, "Are you certain that we know a member of the VCI from a loyal member of the South Vietnam citizenry?" "No, Mr. Congressman, I am not." But despite its brutality, the Phoenix program was a success and the Viet Cong was severely weakened. The South still had a large legitimacy issue. The government had strong support from the country's elite, but barely any from the rural Vietnamese. So on March 26, 1970, President-elect Thieu of South Vietnam signed a bill that redistributed 2.5 million acres of land free of charge to more than 500,000 farm families, winning him massive support. Next, the Allies went after...
Free stuff's always a great way to get people to vote for you. Always has been. And it's never free.
After the Viet Cong supply lines in Laos and Cambodia. Knowing that the US public would never agree to the expansion of the war, the invasion was kept a secret. 30,000 Americans and 50,000 South Vietnam soldiers marched into Cambodia. The massive army broke through the communist lines, killing 10,000 and capturing thousands more, dealing a staggering blow to communist logistics. The attack was accompanied by brutal bombing campaigns over Cambodia that would continue way after the invasion ended, causing horrifying amounts of civilian casualties. There is no other way to describe what was done to Cambodia other than to say that it was bombed back to the Stone Age. The US indiscriminately bombed civilians and combatants alike without mercy. Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, personally picked almost every target.
Really?
As Anthony Bourdain wrote in his memoirs, once you have been to Cambodia, you will never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands.
Really?
Cambodia remains, to this day, the most bombed country in history. Yes, even more than the bombings of Japan or Germany during World War II.
2.7 million tons of bombs dropped over Cambodia. So just for some context here, the RAF and U.S. Army Air Force's tonnages dropped on Germany from 39 to 45. Of course, the highest would be 1944, in which you have 500,000 dropped by the RAF and almost 400,000 tons dropped by the 8th Air Force. Total of about 1.5 million dropped by them during World War II.
The US bombings massacred several hundreds of thousands of people, mostly civilians. The real number will likely never be known, but scholars have estimated between 150 and 800,000 victims. As a consequence of the American bombings, Cambodians flocked towards an extremist group called the Khmer Rouge,
which is going to lead to more than 1 million other deaths. And this is what happens when people who are otherwise either not picking sides or are marginally one side or the other are victimized in this way. It can very often push them strongly into an extremist side that they might not have otherwise sided with.
Would eventually grow enough to take power and carry out a horrifying genocide.
Yep. That's Pol Pot, his gang.
In 1971, the Allies sent a force of 15,000 into Laos, but unlike the one in Cambodia, this incursion was a disaster. Only half of the original force of 15,000 made it back home, with 1,400 American casualties. So they decided to just bomb the f*** out of Laos too. Hey, we saw what you did! That's impossible, I always cover my webcam. How dare you wait, what? What? What are you talking about?
What are you talking about?
What are you talking about?
I knew that's how that was
You just
going.
invaded Cambodia when you said you would stop the war. Oh, thank God. Yeah, I did that. The American public found out about the incursion and they were furious. 150,000 people gathered in San Francisco, another 100,000 in Washington. Protests occurred at nearly 900 colleges and universities, involving more than 1 million students. The American government cracked down on the protests, killing 4 students.
Yeah, that's only a half hour from me, Kent State University, and that's still a pretty big deal here to this day.
With so much opposition to the war, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed in June. The number of US soldiers in Vietnam went from 550,000 to 140,000 by the end of 1971.
It's important to note, too, that the United States never formally declared war in this war. In fact, I think the last time we declared war on another country was World War II. Every war we've been involved with since has not been a formal declaration of war.
The war was slowly turning into what it was always supposed to be, a civil war between Vietnamese to determine the way in which they should be governed. With the end of the war in sight, morale and discipline among US active forces in Vietnam was breaking down. No one wanted to risk getting killed just months before they might go home.
Yeah, why would you?
Drug use among US forces also reached epidemic proportions, with 10 to 25% of enlisted men using heroin.
And like I said earlier, how do you deal with all of this psychologically? Well, some people lash out, some people turn to become even more violent and have all those restraints cast off, and they end up committing massacres and killing civilians and maybe even each other. Others turn to drugs, which apparently were readily available, and that's how they try to cope.
Many would go back home with addiction problems, with no support from the government that had sent them overseas to fight a pointless war.
And this is the unfortunate reality with this, is that when you have a very unpopular war, and rightfully so, unfortunately then that ends up hurting the men who never wanted to be there in the first place, who get sent off to fight in this war. And now they come home psychologically and physically scarred, many of them maimed, and they don't get the help. They don't even have the support. They're not getting cheering crowds and parades when they come back. They're getting stuff thrown at them and protests, and they're getting blamed for a war that they didn't choose.
There was also a dramatic rise in fragging, which is when a soldier deliberately tries to kill a fellow soldier or officer, often using a fragmentation grenade. In June 1971, documents were leaked to the press that showed that the US had been involved in Vietnam all the way back to 1945, much earlier than the public had known. What little public trust there was in the government was shattered, and the American people demanded an immediate end to the war. By 1972, there were only 65,000 Americans in Vietnam.
And that's barely more than the number who died in Vietnam. I think it's 58,000 and change. Are the official number of American dead in Vietnam.
And only 5,000 of them were combat soldiers. The ARVN had largely assumed the responsibility for fighting the war. Nixon was up for re-election, and the North decided to strike once again. On March 30, North Vietnamese troops and tanks crossed the demilitarized zone. The offensive surprised the South Vietnamese defenders, and the North crushed several ARVN divisions. The US Air Force launched a massive bombing campaign and eventually forced the North back with heavy casualties. Just before the US presidential elections, Henry Kissinger negotiated an agreement with the North. There would be a ceasefire and 60 days later, a full US withdrawal. North Vietnam would return all prisoners of war, and the tripartite commission composed of 2 US officials, the Viet Cong and neutral parties would later convene to determine the nature of the government in the South.
And some of these POWs at this point have spent 5, 6, 7 years in captivity. Many of them have been tortured. Some of them don't make it out alive at all.
The American public was excited, and Nixon won the election by a landslide. Hey, that's bull. That agreement is going to kill my government. You either make these changes or I'm not signing anything. Let's just fight some more then. Wanna go back to our original agreement? Yeah. Well, I'm not signing that. Yes, you are. Yes, I am. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Americans, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords. Within 2 months, the remaining 20,000 American military personnel left the country, and the communists released 600 POWs who returned to their families.
And that was the end of it,
both
right?
Vietnams quickly violated the ceasefire. While South Vietnam had now one of the largest and best equipped armed forces in the world, without the Americans, they did not have the capacity to maintain it. But wait, you know what would be a great idea? Breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
Watergate.
What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. With the Watergate scandal, the White House became paralyzed, and financial aid to South Vietnam decreased even further. The South Vietnam economy, massively dependent on the American military presence, fell into a deep economic crisis with rising unemployment. Morale in the army crumbled, and the ARVN suffered from massive desertions. And now that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not getting bombed anymore, and also thanks to some aid from their good pals China and the Soviet Union, the North was in a great position. On December
And the South doesn't have that support anymore, so they might have been able to hold out against the North alone, but not the North supported by China and the Soviet Union.
12th, 1974, North Vietnam launched a massive offensive. They marched toward the provincial capital of Phuoc Long. The military command abandoned the city and left its defenders to fend for themselves. The garrison made a valiant last stand, but were overrun. The North moved toward Buon Ma Thuot, but the ARVN command was fooled into believing the advance was a diversion and instead reinforced what they believed was the true objective at Pleiku. Buon Ma Thuot fell rapidly, and chaos broke out as terrified refugees fled the advancing North Vietnamese army. The fleeing soldiers and civilians became entangled, and the Viet Cong blew up bridges and felled trees to slow them down. Northern artillery and rockets bombarded the crowd, killing civilians and soldiers alike. The South.
The point is that the whole thing was a nightmare, and in the end, what ends up happening, what would have happened if the U.S. had never gotten involved in the first place. That was the end result.
Collapsed with astonishing speed. Within just a few weeks, the North had surrounded the capital, Saigon. President Thieu resigned and fled the country.
And this is where you get these iconic images of people on the rooftops trying to get those last few helicopters out of Saigon.
Some armed commanders and their troops bravely fought to the end, while many others abandoned their posts and fled. Just before midday on April 30, Northern forces burst through the presidential palace. The Viet Cong flag was hoisted, and South Vietnam ceased to exist. Desperate South Vietnamese rushed to harbors and airfields to try to get out of the country. Some managed to get out aboard US naval vessels, but most were left behind. In the end, nothing was accomplished. Vietnam was unified under North Vietnamese rule, exactly as would have happened without US involvement.
It's exactly the point. Millions of people died, many more suffered, billions of dollars lost. For what? To end up with the same thing you had anyway. And in the end, the big fear, of course, that the domino effect would happen doesn't end up happening.
The war did nothing but lead to the deaths of millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of American soldiers who were deceived by their government into believing they were fighting for something meaningful.
Yep.
In the South, many collaborators were executed. Many others were sent to re-education camps to live in horrible conditions. Both South and North Vietnam were left in ruins, and recovery was long and difficult. Tens of millions of gallons of herbicides were unleashed over the country, devastating the local flora and fauna. American chemicals are also responsible for the abnormally high rates of cancers, chromosomal damage, birth defects, and long-lasting neurological disorders that have been detected in sprayed areas.
The bottom line, there's nothing honorable about war. Soldiers can do honorable things, can perform acts of great heroism, but in the end, the act of war itself is just nothing but death and destruction. And it's, as I said before, it's the civilians who in the end up being the one to suffer the most. Not that soldiers don't suffer terribly as well.
Throughout the war, the US dropped over 7.5 million tons of explosives over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia.
Oh, goodness.
This is 3 times more than the amount the Allies dropped both over Europe and Japan in the entirety of World War II.
Wow.
On average, a bomb fell on Laos every 8 minutes for 9 years. Unexploded bombs remain a huge problem in these countries, and there have been at least 50,000 deaths or injuries in the past 50 years.
It's very much like Europe with the areas that are still affected by stuff from World War I and World War II.
The vast majority of them, civilians.
Yep.
And some as recent as 2022. Henry Kissinger, the mastermind behind the genocide, would later be given a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in ending the war. He recently passed away in his home at the age of 100. The US signed an agreement pledging to grant over $3 billion in aid over 5 years to aid the reconstruction of Vietnam. But they never delivered. Instead, they imposed a complete embargo on trade and assistance to the country, which lasted until 1994.
And now it's a popular tourist destination. So, in fact, I'd be curious to hear from anybody in the comment section who's actually been to Vietnam as a tourist, or, as to visit family. Just what's it like there today? What was your experience? I've heard actually very, very positive things from people who've gone to Vietnam about the people, about the scenery. Would very much like to visit there myself someday if I get the chance. So let me know in the comment section below what you think about that. And just as we wrap up, I want to say thank you to Joseph D. Again, no address, sorry, so I don't know where you are. And also Damien in Russell, Kansas. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. If you want to find out more how you can sponsor this channel on Patreon, the link is down in the description. Thanks for watching.